While critics spend their days attacking rhetoric and demanding photo op accountability, something extraordinary is unfolding in Canadian trade relationships, and the numbers prove it is not just talk anymore. The United Kingdom has officially overtaken China as Canada's second largest export market. In the first 11 months of 2025 alone, Canadian exports to the UK hit $42.5 billion compared to just $31 billion to China. That is a 60% increase, and it happened while everyone was busy arguing about whether Prime Minister Mark Carney was doing real work or just delivering empty speeches. Turns out he was doing both, and one of them is reshaping Canada's economic future in ways that seemed impossible just months ago. John Ivison wrote a piece in the National Post published February 16, 2025, with a headline that probably does not appear on Pierre Poilievre's reading list. Canada pivot to Europe for trade gains traction as Trump loses momentum. That is not speculation, and that is not aspiration. That is documented economic reality, backed by hard export data from Statistics Canada. And it is happening precisely because Carney stood at the World Economic Forum in Davos and delivered a speech that world leaders called groundbreaking, while Canadian conservative pundits dismissed it as word salad and all talk no. Action. Here is what actually happened. Carney did not just talk about diversification in Davos. He laid out a strategic framework where middle powers like Canada needed to bond together and create their own trading partnerships instead of remaining dependent on larger economies that could weaponize that dependence whenever politically convenient. And he delivered one of the most memorable lines in recent diplomatic history: middle powers acting together need to do this because if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. That was not just a clever soundbite. That was a declaration of strategic independence, and it is already producing measurable results. The $42.5 billion in exports to the UK did not materialize by accident. Yes, part of that includes gold trade. Britain is a global hub, and Canada is a major producer. When you dig into the statistics, there were also solid rises in agri-food, clean tech, and aircraft exports. These are not one-time anomalies. These are patterns indicating structural shifts in how Canadian exporters are approaching global markets. And this is exactly what Carney talked about in Davos when he emphasized that Canada needed to become less reliant on the American economy, not by cutting ties, but by building genuine alternatives. And the timing could not be more critical. Donald Trump, who is a former president of the United States and current political force, is threatening to drop out of CUSMA, the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement altogether, suggesting maybe there should not even be a trade deal. He is threatening to block the Gordie Howe International Bridge opening. He is threatening 100% tariffs if Canada signs any trade agreement with China. The rhetoric has become constant white noise, loud, unpredictable, and increasingly detached from economic reality. But here's what Trump and his supporters do not seem to understand. Every threat he makes and every destabilizing move accelerates exactly the diversification strategy Carney outlined in Davos. Former Finance Minister John Manley pointed out something crucial. Canada existed before these free trade deals, and if given the choice between having them or not, sure, we would prefer to have them. But Canada has pivoted before, and Canada can pivot again. The data shows Canada is pivoting right now, not out of choice, but out of necessity, created by Trump's own erratic behavior. Conservative critics, particularly Pierre Poilievre, have spent months attacking Carney as nothing more than a globe-trotting photo-op politician who talks endlessly without delivering results. Poilievre mocked Carney Davos' speech as unrealistic, aspirational nonsense that would never translate into actual policy. Columnists like Jamal Giovanni traveled to Washington, blaming everything wrong with Canada's economy on Carney, while refusing to even mention Trump's name or acknowledge tariff impacts. They pushed a narrative that Carney needed to kiss Donald Trump's ring and align Canadian policy with whatever chaos emerges from the White House on any given day. But the numbers tell a completely different story. Carney is not just talking, he is walking the walk by actively negotiating deals with the UK, with Scandinavian nations, and with European partners. And he is doing something even more ambitious that seemed impossible until recently, facilitating discussions between the European Union and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which includes Canada, to create some form of coalition, an international trading partnership, bridging one side of the world with the other. Canada joined the Trans-Pacific Partnership years ago under Stephen Harper, and it has been beneficial. But what Carney is doing now goes far beyond managing existing agreements. According to reporting, Carney and his staff have been directly involved in discussions between the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the European Union about creating a broader economic framework. The endgame appears to be establishing coordinated trade relationships that reduce vulnerability to economic coercion from larger powers, whether that is the United States under Trump or China or anyone else who might try to weaponize market access for political leverage. This is what Carney meant in Davos when he talked about middle nations bonding together. It was not abstract philosophy. It was operational strategy, and it is already moving from concept to negotiation to implementation. And Canada, under Carney leadership, is at the center of those discussions, precisely because of his credibility as former Bank of Canada governor, former Bank of England governor, and someone who understands global financial systems better than virtually any other head of government currently in office. Meanwhile, Trump-owned policies are backfiring on American soil. Data from the Congressional Budget Office shows that American consumers and businesses are now bearing 95% of the cost of Trump tariffs. The effective tariff rate is now 13 points higher than it was in 2024. And Americans are starting to see the consequences directly. Rising inflation, reduced real investment, lower GDP growth, and reduced employment. Trump cannot blame Joe Biden anymore. This is the direct result of Trump tariff policies, and it is hurting the American economy heading into midterm elections in November. Just last week, Congress voted narrowly to condemn what Trump is doing with tariffs, asserting that trade authority belongs to Congress, not the executive branch. They did not get the two-thirds majority needed to make it veto-proof, so Trump will veto it. But the fact that even Republicans are starting to push back signals something important. Trump is facing resistance from his own party because their constituents across the United States rely on trade with Canada for softwood, lumber, steel, aluminum, and countless other products. And those constituents are getting angry about rising costs directly attributable to Trump trade war. If Trump decides in one of his increasingly erratic moments to walk away from CUSMA negotiations entirely, even hardcore MAGA Republicans in Congress and the Senate are going to push back hard. They know their political survival depends on defending economic interests in their districts and states, and many of those interests depend on stable trade with Canada. Politics is politics, and self-preservation always wins. They are not going to sacrifice their seats to remain loyal to Trump chaos. This creates significant leverage for Canada. While Trump makes threats and imposes random tariffs, Carney is methodically building alternatives, and Canadian voters are noticing. Recent polling shows the Liberals have opened up their largest lead over Conservatives since Carney became Liberal leader just over a year ago. In companion polling asking which leader Canadians would most want as Prime Minister during difficult times, Carney has significantly widened his lead over Poilievre. Canadians are watching what their Prime Minister is doing, and they are responding. There's a long way to go, and many challenges remain. There will be bumps along the road. But Canada is moving in the right direction, and Canadians are finally reflecting some optimism for the first time in a long time. That is the result of the work the Canadian government is doing under Carney leadership. Here is the critical takeaway. Canada is concerned about cost of living, and Canada is concerned about the unpredictable chaos coming from the White House. But the buffer against that chaos is being actively constructed right now through trade diversification. Canada cannot ignore the American economy, but Canada does not need to remain hostage to it. And statistics prove that diversification is already happening at scale. The UK overtaking China as Canada's second largest export market seemed impossible. Coordinating trade frameworks between the European Union and the Trans-Pacific Partnership seemed unrealistic. Building genuine economic alternatives to US market dependence seemed like fantasy. And yet all of it is happening not in theory, but in documented trade flows, in diplomatic negotiations, and in measurable export increases. Conservative critics refuse to acknowledge this progress because it undermines their entire political narrative. They have invested everything in portraying Carney as incompetent, and his speeches as empty words, and his diplomacy as meaningless photo ops. Admitting that he is actually delivering results means admitting they were wrong. So they double down, ignore the data, and hope Canadian voters do not notice. But Canadians are noticing. The polling proves it. The export numbers prove it. The international credibility Canada is building proves it. While Poilievre delivers slogans and refuses to acknowledge reality, Carney is doing the actual work of governance, and it is producing results that seemed impossible just months ago. More challenges lie ahead. Trump will continue his unpredictable threats, and economic pressures will persist. But for the first time in years, Canada has a prime minister who is not just reacting to crisis. He is proactively building alternatives. And the more conservative critics refuse to acknowledge that progress, the more irrelevant they become to serious policy discussions. Political idealism cannot replace economic reality. And the economic reality is clear. Mark Carney did what critics said was impossible, and he is doing it while they are still complaining that he only talks